Hello, Bogan here. To my fellow workers in the vineyard, worldwide, greetings. A war against men and things male is currently underway in much of the world. The exact form and content of this war varies from one region to the next, but anecdotal exceptions notwithstanding, it is more or less present everywhere. Well, it is fashionable to scoff at the very idea that a war against men is happening. That is understandable, given that whoever is complicit in such a war would instinctively wish to cover it up and change the subject. Now, to be fair, we can admit that the phrase war against men sounds a bit melodramatic and might seem outlandish to anybody who lives a comparatively sheltered life. So, in the interest of making things clear, let's try something that is less metaphoric and emotive and more objectively descriptive. Let us say that a state of pernicious anti-male bias pervades the culture at large. Let us add that this state of anti-male bias is insidious, expansionist, attritional, and opposed to male well-being. To elaborate, this state of anti-male bias is rooted in traditional culture. Patriarchy, as a feminist might say. This traditional culture harbors gynocentrism and male disposability at its core. Now, the post-industrial trend known as feminism does not overthrow traditional culture, but rather extends it and retrofits it in order to maximize female advantage and to enlarge the scope of female power as a whole. In traditional culture, men and women lived under a social arrangement where each group, as a group, had particular rights and responsibilities. Now, this arrangement tended to favor women in some ways and men in others. However, the feminist effort has been to lift responsibilities from women and to expand their rights while placing more responsibilities on men and reducing their rights. In sum, the feminist effort has been to increase favoritism toward women. And the growth of anti-male bias has been both a natural consequence of this favoritism and a spur to the continued expansion of it. The present statement is an objective description of reality, and feminist assertions to the contrary may be classified as propaganda. The war against men, defined as a pervasive state of anti-male bias, accordingly draws force from both the pre-feminist or the traditional culture and from a willful feminist effort to capitalize on that culture. The feminist effort has amounted to a campaign of aggression renewed through time with no clearly stipulated endpoint. This campaign has been directed toward a designated enemy, namely men and things male, or, as feminist euphemism would have it, the patriarchy. It is chiefly for these reasons that we feel justified in speaking of a war against men. We know the expression is metaphorical and not always obvious until certain things are pointed out. However, once these things are pointed out and made visible, they stubbornly refuse to be invisible again. Once you see, you cannot unsee. We find it cumbersome to be forever inserting the phrase, a state of pernicious anti-male bias which pervades the culture at large, into our speech and writing. It is more expedient to say war against men. Additionally, for reasons given, this usage accurately describes what is happening on Earth. So, we will continue to speak of a war against men, as our pleasure dictates, because we find it both expedient and accurate to do so. Fiedel Morgan, out.